Women are the kind of people that people come out of.
Is it good that women can vote in America? I don't think so, and here's why.
Ain't it fun?
Okay, that's enough. And action. I think by now we've seen the trends when it comes to the church, particularly with Gen Z. More men are joining the church and more women are leaving the church. This is a huge symptom of an ongoing gender war that's been raging for a while now. In fact, in 2023, the Survey Center on American Life found that 39% of Gen Z women identify as religiously unaffiliated, compared to 34% of Gen Z men. This flips the historical trend where men are usually the one leaving the pews. With this in mind, I think the church is also handling this completely the wrong way. You know about those conservative influencers that talk so much about bringing back old manlyhood as well as trad wife for the ladies? It's literally the exact opposite of modern feminist content that glamorizes girl boss and doesn't exactly view masculinity as anything special, or flat out demonizes it. Now, some of the content is full-on misandrous and man-hating, but that's a fringe minority, and that doesn't necessarily come from Christians either. Now, given that the United States is naturally a patriarchal society, and I listened to pastors specifically trying to strengthen said patriarchy, I'm going to hone in on this angle. Can you imagine a society where we regress maybe 150 years, where women had no right to vote, can't work her own job, and has to spend her whole life in the kitchen? That's being pushed by pastors like Partridge. He's built his whole platform around this. It's also a bummer that he has more followers than me. But maybe you can help that by clicking the subscribe button. But anyway, can you imagine if Dale said this in maybe 2007 when the Republican Party was a lot more normal and wasn't so extreme like it is right now under Trump? This type of thing would never be tolerated back then. Or would it? One can argue that all the extremists became normal in the age of social media, but I don't know. It doesn't really change the fact that these extreme voices are becoming more normal in society, which we have to talk about first. Case in point, when Dale says that women shouldn't vote, he isn't just speaking to his followers. He's triggering a wave of hate watches and angry comments that the algorithm rewards for high engagement. And this isn't unique to just Dale. Joel Webben is a common voice for these far-right takes, including his misogynistic ones. And then there's Caleb Lyons with his progressive theology that's pure purpose is just to anger conservatives, I suppose. And I don't really need to say much more about Doug Wilson. This guy's just an older version of Dale. He's a theologian without a seminary degree, who recently just got platformed by CNN. Next. Now, online men have really easy access to this type of content. I'm talking red pill, manosphere, and incel. Now, Dale Partridge is a perfect example of a Theobro culture that's gaining traction in young Christian men today. These are young, online-dwelling, ultra-conservative Christian men who use bro culture aesthetics to push high-control, patriarchal views using the Bible to justify it. Now, imagine this type of content being pushed onto millions of lonely men eager for a godly marriage with a godly woman. The algorithm might as well be pushing red pill content with a Jesus sticker on it. This is nuts. And this speaks to two problems: the complete incompetence of social media to help with men's mental health, and even worse, the safety of young women out of fear of going to church alongside these types of men. If you ever wonder why Gen Z men are joining the church and more Gen Z women are leaving, this may very well be a symptom of that. There's also the fact that feminism is more consistently antagonized by Christian influencers nowadays. Given that the movement has been a long-standing enemy of patriarchy, it's the perfect final boss for the Theobro narrative. They frame feminism as this monolith of man-hating rather than a quest for legal and social equality. By doing this, they can present their brand of patriarchy not just as biblical, but also as a necessary rescue mission for a collapsing society. It's a classic us versus them tactic that forces young men to choose between their faith and the dignity of women sitting right next to them in the pews. The thing is, this Theobro subculture treats theology like locker room talk. It's driving Gen Z women out the door in record numbers. So to combat these harmful narratives that these Theobros are pushing, we should push for better biblical literacy to educate these young men with. So one of my favorite reads is Beth Allison Barr's book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. She presents a case on how patriarchy is mostly a cultural thing and not so much a biblical thing. Her idea is that patriarchy existed as far back as the Epic of Gilgamesh, which came long before the Bible. Her point being that patriarchy is cultural and has been there before Christianity even existed. But let's talk about the Bible itself. There are two models for biblical womanhood: egalitarianism and complementarianism. Some of the more egalitarian scriptures that more feminist theologians use include Galatians 3, Acts 18, and Romans 16. The common trend between these is that they give a perspective on women serving in leadership roles in the church. They also hint to Paul's philosophy against the patriarchy of the time. But on the other hand, complementarian scriptures include 1 Timothy 2, 1 Corinthians 14, and Ephesians 5. More conservative theologians dictate this as exclusive male leadership. But have they been pushed too far into patriarchy? We need to talk about this. Now, Ephesians 5 is the easy one. It's pretty simple. Theobros will quote verse 22 suggesting that women should submit. Full stop. Nice try, but they do this without quoting verse 21, where Paul says submit to one another, or even verse 25, where he commands to love your wives like Christ loved the church. Basically, in its whole context, it can be argued to be an egalitarian verse. Next. 1 Timothy is where it can get a bit more challenging. First of all, Timothy was in Ephesus, which was the center of the cult of Artemis. In this pagan cult, women were high priests and men were pretty much excluded or subjugated. Pretty weird stuff, huh? But here, the Greek word for authority is authenteion. It's used once in the whole Bible. It doesn't mean healthy leadership, it means to usurp, to domineer, or even to unalive. In its whole context, Paul probably wasn't making a universal rule for all women at the time. He was likely telling a group of women in Ephesus to stop domineering or usurping the men with false Artemis-influenced teaching. Okay, here's the hardest one. Ready? 1 Corinthians 14. This is probably the biggest deal breaker for both Christians and non-Christians to think that our faith is the formula for patriarchy. But there's nuance, thankfully. Scholars do note that earlier in chapter 11, Paul gives instructions on how women should pray and prophesy in church. If Paul really wanted them silent, he wouldn't have told them how to speak or prophesy 3 chapters earlier. Also, most scholars believe Paul was addressing specific disruptions. Maybe women were asking questions loudly during the service because they hadn't been educated yet. He was calling for order, not censorship. In any case, there's an insane amount of debate for Paul's teachings on biblical womanhood. You can even argue that Paul was the first feminist of the Roman world in how he challenged patriarchy given the full picture. If you think about it, he took a culture where women were property and told men, no, you owe her your life. He also took a culture where women were uneducated and said, let them learn. Now look, my church is complementarian, and we have a male pastor, but we don't believe in Dale's version of patriarchy.
Nope.
Why? Because the Bible distinguishes between the covenant and the world. The view that men and women have equal essence and worth, but different functions, only applies to the home and the church. In fact, most complementarians would say that a woman can be a CEO, a lawyer, or a voter. These are societal roles, not covenantal ones. Bottom line, the Bible gives instructions on how a local church and a nuclear family should function. It does not provide a blueprint for a 21st century secular government. So, how do we move forward in fighting this hyper-patriarchal culture? I actually think it's pretty simple. We look at Jesus and how he uplifted women despite the norms of his time. It was basically unheard of that he'd be so uplifting to sinful women, and even elected Mary Magdalene to preach the first Easter sermon. No matter whether you lean egalitarian or complementarian, both paths should lead to uplifting women or empowering them in society one way or another. In fact, my complementarian church has a board of deacons full of women who are more theologically sound than I am. Now, as far as patriarchy goes, we can listen to anything that Paul said or even cite the Old Testament's more male-led structure, but it defeats the purpose if we conflate any of that with undermining women's values in society and reducing her to a desired trad wife or whatever. And one more thing to note, this whole Theobro movement relies heavily on aesthetic. High-production videos, old-world imagery, and confident rhetoric that's basically arrogance, to mask a paper-thin philosophy. So we as the church have to be louder in a culture that values extremes, which is exactly what I do in this video, talking about 2 opposing narratives of love. Today, the extreme we have to call out is rooted in systemic sexism. Don't be like Dale Partridge, be like Jesus Christ. God bless.